Hello, and welcome to the discussion on psychological impediments to cogent reasoning. I think that this is a particularly interesting section. An entire semester's class could be offered on just a fraction of the material touched upon in this chapter. We're barely scratching the surface here, but we will talk about some quite interesting material. There are some links to quite a few longish videos in this PowerPoint. You may wish, therefore, to take a break during this PowerPoint and come back to where you left off and continue watching because of this. That's just fine. It's a lot to take in at once. You may even wish to do this in 3 settings. This won't be because I'll be talking so much the whole time, but simply because there's so much good material to go through in this section. The good news is that this material, unlike material on deductive forms and so forth, is not highly abstract. There are also a large number of psych majors in this class who will hopefully find this section especially provocative. But even if you're not particularly interested in psychology, these psychological issues can get in the way of good reasoning for all of us, and they are very much worth being aware of. Human beings are social animals, so loyalty as a survival strategy makes sense. The primary adaptive strategy of human beings is culture, including passing down knowledge and tools from generation to generation, and culture is a social phenomenon. This is why the growth of humanity has been exponential. Most other animals start anew with each generation. Some animals, we have discovered, do have a very limited culture. They can teach a few things to their offsprings, but they are very limited in this respect, and they have no way of permanently recording data or discussing methods of improvement. Since culture, and therefore society, is so important to human beings writ large, it becomes important to our survival as individuals. Individuals that do well within a society are more likely to survive and pass their genes on than those who do not. Because of this, loyalty to one's own in-group pays off. Think about it. If a group rewarded disloyalty, that group would tend to be at a disadvantage when competing against other groups. Those groups that survived over countless generations survived, in part, because they had loyal members. This selection for loyalty, in part, explains the natural psychological pull towards loyalty we feel. This creates a natural herd instinct. The herd instinct carries on today in many forms: loyalty to family, loyalty to friends, loyalty to community, loyalty to larger community, loyalty to country. From school pride to pride in one's sports team to favoring one's race or gender, there seems to be a natural pull towards herding in this way. So what is the problem with this? As already discussed, it can have advantages to both the group and the individual. Win-win, right? And on top of that, we feel that morally sometimes people deserve our loyalty. The problem comes in when loyalty causes us to think or behave irrationally. After all, from a purely rational point of view, the fact that something is popular is irrelevant to what is true. From a more pragmatic point of view, if some people morally deserve our loyalty, that implies that some people might not deserve it, even if they are normally in a position to get it. We, for example, normally think that our parents deserve our loyalty. Our instinct might be to say that it's good for a child to be loyal to her parents. But is it good if that loyalty extends to hiding the fact that her parents are raping her? Should a wife's loyalty to her husband extend to concealing a cold-blooded sadistic murder? Should one's loyalty to one's country extend to a war that is unjust? Remember that Hitler was elected in Nazi Germany. Were good Germans therefore bound by patriotism to support his invasion of Poland? Here are a couple of famous psychological experiments. They show us the power of both how groups affect us and how our own insight as to why we do and say what we do isn't always 100% accurate. I will count down from 5 so that you have time to pause these. Remember, you can move the mouse down to the bottom of the screen. A menu should appear. Under one of those options should be an option to pause. If you pause the presentation, you should be able to then click on the images to hyperlink to them. When you are done, click back and the PowerPoint should start again. I'll count down from 5. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. The sinking of the MV seawall in North Korea provides a recent real-life example of people dying because of both the herd instinct and also the fallacy of appeal to authority. A ferry, overloaded and structurally destabilized so that it could move more cargo in North Korea, was tipping over. The crew instructed passengers to stay in their cabins and not to panic. Many obeyed because of the habit of obeying authority. But once the majority obeys, everybody else tended to follow, even though many felt that the situation was dire. Meanwhile, much of the crew actually evacuated, while those left in the cabins died. Approximately 300 people died total. When we are convinced that something is right or good because most people are doing it, we are committing an informal fallacy known as the bandwagon or ad populum fallacy. Here's a clip that contains several examples of this fallacy. Again, I will count down so that you can pause. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Another variation of the same sort of error is this practice of continuing to do something because someone was raised that way oneself. My parents spanked me until I had welts nearly every week with the belt, and I think I'm great, so I'm going to do the same thing to my children. The point here isn't whether or not physical discipline is ever good or bad. The point is the fact that whether or not you were raised a particular way yourself is irrelevant to whether or not it's good or bad. To find out whether it's effective, the thing to do is to look at the consensus of experts who have done studies on the effectiveness. Read the findings. And if you question the findings, read how the studies were done and see if you are rejecting them because of problems with the studies, contradicting studies, or problems with the methodology. We won't rehash everything that goes into good appeals to authority here. And again, the point here is just to give an example of how people continue to believe things because of social inertia or because they were raised a given way and so forth. It isn't to point out which belief on any given particular issue is correct. As many of you know, there's been a recent blowout in the NFL regarding child abuse because of Adrian Peterson. This clip here contains some bits of Sean Hannity defending corporal punishment. The problem is that Hannity's defense have nothing at all to do with any reasoning about what actually works as far as raising children. His appeal is entirely about, number one, what was done to him, and number two, traditions that he is familiar with. Now, before viewing the clip, there are a couple things I want to say. First, for the sake of this PowerPoint, corporal punishment isn't the issue. We're talking about logic and the need to use, and we need to use real-life examples for illustrating this reasoning. Ultimately, all positions are open for revision, given evidence, and I have no axes to grind. Also, and more importantly, it isn't about liberals or conservatives. The guys who did this clip tend to criticize conservatives, and I don't really like the way they are making fun of Hannity here at the same time that they are saying that he was abused. If they really think that he was abused, then there's nothing funny about it, and this kind of bothers me. Unfortunately, they are the ones that happen to have the clips that I was looking for put together, and in addition, they do make the points regarding the fallacy of reasoning. And so, after a bit of deliberation, I decided to include it anyways, so long as I gave that little caveat at the beginning. I do my best to provide examples of fallacious reasoning from all over the political spectrum. I also provide the anonymous comments forum so that you can tell me how you feel. I very much want everybody in the course to feel like she or he can voice their views. Keeping in mind, of course, that this is a logic course, so whether those views are liberal or conservative or authoritarian or anarchistic or religious or atheistic or anything in between, all those spectrums, simply one needs to defend the positions with arguments and avoid fallacies, regardless of what they are. Okay. So, watch that video. I'm going to go ahead and give a little countdown so that you have time to pause it. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. The herd instinct can also be responsible for cultural lag. Cavender and Kahane define this as the tendency of practices and beliefs to persist long after whatever conditions made them useful or sensible have disappeared. Because people have a tendency to keep believing what those around them believe, it takes some time for knowledge that experts and well-informed individuals have to filter through to the population. Now think about what happens when you combine this with the tendency towards other fallacies we have already discussed, like the appeal towards tradition and custom. People oftentimes continue to do something in a particular way just because it has always been, at least in their memory, done that way, even though it might not be the best way to do it. So here you have a tendency of people to do things because it was always done that way. Then on top of that, you have a tendency of people to continue to do things because other people are doing it that way. These two psychological tendencies have a synergistic effect. They feed on one another. This helps feed technophobia, or what I sometimes called Mary Shelley Frankenstein syndrome, fear of new technologies, especially when they don't simply add a new convenience but modify the way things have been done. For example, the first in vitro fertilization, Louise Brown, in 1978, was extremely controversial, much like stem cell research or efforts to clone are now. At the time, television evangelists talked about how this was an abomination, some saying how the child wouldn't have a soul, and that this new technology threatened civilization as we know it. Now in vitro fertilization is commonly used by couples who have difficulty conceiving, and it's done so by people all on the political and religious scale, from liberals to conservative Christians. Oftentimes, even on the conservative Christian end, they're fighting now to preserve these embryos and stuff and stop them from being destroyed, when before, they didn't even like Louise Brown existing. Some of them thought that she had supernatural powers and horrible things like that. Of course, this does not mean that modern controversies about technologies can just be brushed off as necessarily exactly like the old ones. Every argument needs to be looked at on its merits. Arguments against cloning tech or stem cell research or genetic engineering and so forth have to be looked at individually. But what the Louise Brown case does is it shows us that there's oftentimes a very strong pull against anything that seems to change the way things are traditionally done, and that people can oftentimes think very irrationally about these sorts of things, and that what seems very controversial for a while can then very quickly become generally accepted. You may or may not wish to pause to read the little quotes here, and so forth. So if there's a problem in the reasoning, what can one do to try to do better? Because we've seen how this kind of reasoning might go wrong. So how might one try to examine a problem that one feels strongly about more objectively? If one wanted to put aside any bias for or against, one thing to do is to try to think of what kind of standards ahead of time one might find convincing for settling the argument. What kind of studies might sway one way or another? For example, would a study investigating whether animals tended to learn better from physical punishment or from other means work better? Would that help convince one way or another? Would a study investigating whether children who have been physically punished tend to behave better or worse in the long run convince one way or another? Deciding on the kinds of things that might convince you ahead of time and then looking for the evidence is a good way to be more objective. It's a way of deciding what kind of evidence is going to affect you and then seeing what the evidence says, instead of seeing what says out there and then rationalizing away as to whether or not it's important. This is the opposite way that most people tend to investigate issues that they're close to. Most people decide what it is they want to believe and then specifically look for bits of evidence that might support that and dismiss, or maybe they don't even look for, evidence to the contrary of their own opinions. The result is that they end up convincing themselves more than ever that their original opinion was correct, even if it turns out that the evidence that they sifted through tended to point in the opposite direction, or simply turned up mountains of research against them, but just a few elements for them. Because what they do is they tend to dismiss what they don't like, or perhaps they don't even find it because they're only Googling or looking for what supports their point of view in the very first place. Patriotism usually has a positive connotation, and depending on how we understand it, it's not necessarily a negative thing. But blind patriotism can have horrific consequences. We might want to ask, for example, if it's good to be so patriotic that one never criticizes one's country. This would mean that if the government started to institute a curfew for all people, adults and children, all citizens, of 8 p.m., we wouldn't criticize it. It means that if the government decided to torture designated enemies and their families in public and release videos of it as a way of terrorizing and demoralizing an enemy in time of war, we wouldn't criticize it. The extreme side says your country is always right. Love it or leave it. But does it mean that you love something, that you don't love something, or even love it less, if you criticize it? Does somebody who refuses to say anything bad about their country love it more? Is the following analogy a strong or a weak one, do you think? Consider, would a loving parent praise their child for an F paper if they knew the child could do better? Would a loving parent praise or even tolerate their child biting another child for no reason, or stealing from others? I think that most parents would likely say that it's part of being a loving parent not to shower your child with praise when she or he does things that are wrong, but rather to criticize her and give her a time out or other punishment when needed. It doesn't mean that one loves the child that was bitten by your own child because you're siding with the child that was bitten over your own. It doesn't mean that one cares about the store more than one's own child because one's siding with the store that your child stole from over your own child. Instead, what it means is that really and truly caring about your child, or at least these parents argue, means that you also care about your child's moral development. Those who say that true patriots criticize their country's wrongdoings and don't get lost in symbols argue that, in a democracy, the citizens and voters are very much like the parents. It is their duty to become active when the entity they are responsible for becomes unruly, or develops bad habits, or behaves immorally, and that it isn't lack of love that causes them to do this, but the presence of it. They say that, instead, it is easy to wrap oneself in the flag and slogans and get praise from others for doing so, just like it's easy to praise one's own kids and get hugs and kisses, even when they do things wrong. But that doesn't mean that you love them the most, or that you are doing what is right when you do so. Of course, I'm not preaching a point here. These are arguments given. We have talked about arguments from analogy. It's up to you to think about this more, see if you can pull more in the way of one argument for one side or the other, and see if you think it's a strong or weak analogy. How far would you go towards either side, one way or another? And think about it more as you have time. And of course, you should be careful not to fall into the either or false dilemma fallacy. There could be plenty of room for middle ground or entirely alternative views. So you should think about that. So the first page on the next page has lots of quotes from people critical of the idea of patriotism. So here are just a few examples of that. Here's Mark Twain. He says, patriotism is supporting your country all the time and your government when it deserves it. Here's another one. Men love their country not because it's great, but because it's their own. George Bernard Shaw has this very famous one. Patriotism is your conviction that your country is superior to all others because you were born in it. In other words, the idea is that if you were born in another country, you would be just as patriotic towards it. This is probably one of the very most famous quotes on patriotism. Patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel, to which Ambrose Bierce made a response saying that patriotism is defined as the last refuge of a scoundrel. With all due respect to an enlightened but inferior lexicographer, I beg to submit that it's the first. He was quipping there. Oscar Wilde says that patriotism is the virtue of the vicious, right here. Tagore says, I will not buy glass for the price of diamonds, and I will not allow patriotism to triumph over humanity. Ron Paul, modern person here, says that real patriotism is a willingness to challenge the government when it's wrong. And George Orwell says that the nationalist not only does not disapprove of atrocities committed by his own side, but has a remarkable capacity of not even hearing about them. Here, on the other hand, we have some people taking up the opposite views. People who are worried about the lack of patriotism in the country. The first is from a site aimed at patriotism for kids. The second is from the Fox 5, lamenting what they perceive as a decline of patriotism in the U.S. Surrounding these are examples of patriotism in advertising. Advertisers caught on long ago that patriotic symbols can help to sell products. So I'm going to pause again so that you have a chance to put the video or put the PowerPoint on hold so that you can click on these video links and see what you think about them, and then compare, what these people have to say with the quotes on the previous page, and think about where you stand, if you stand somewhere between the two extremes or at one of the extremes, what have you. Again, not pushing a point here. The main point here from a logical standpoint is simply that we feel cultural pressures and they can influence how we rationally think about ideas. Provincialism, once again as Cavender and Kahane defined it, is the natural tendency to identify with the ideas, interests, and kinds of behavior favored by those in groups with which we identify. If you're a woman, you might be more prone to sympathize with women, and if you're a man, with men. When you're a teen, you might be more prone to sympathize with teens, and when you're an adult, you might be more prone to sympathize with adults. Why is this a problem? Because whether or not you were born a man or a woman doesn't change the nature of reality for the rest of the world. If you're wondering whether or not teens are treated fairly, the truth doesn't start out one way because you're a teen, and then change when you're an adult. Whether or not women are getting a fair shake doesn't depend on whether or not you yourself are a woman. Ideally, if you could wipe away all knowledge of yourself as an individual and then analyze the facts, you could evaluate such issues much more objectively. But in practice, we can't do this. What we need to do is attempt to do this as far as possible, as well as attempt to imagine what it's like to be in other people's shoes. Being objective and empathizing with the situation of others are skills that require practice every bit as much as playing the flute or writing or making mathematical calculations. In the U.S. especially, we tend to downplay the news of other countries. Most of us could not name even the top leaders in major ally nations of the U.S. In many cases, we can't even find these locations on a map. And to be completely upfront, my own geography isn't the strongest in the world. To some extent, this comes down to the fact that the U.S. is a larger superpower, and so we're less concerned with what other countries do. But to some extent, this also has to do with how news is sensationalized here, and to some extent it has to do with our culture. But regardless of the reason, fair to understand the lives of those around us, whether it be people of another gender, another subculture, within our own, another religion, people in other countries, in terms of making large-scale political decisions, all these things can cause us to make mistakes. Understanding how others are is a type of knowledge which can help us make better decisions, and downplaying our own bias helps us not weigh our own personal experiences disproportionately high. You might view the latter as a type of sampling error, both unrepresentative and small sample. That is to say, counting your own personal experiences as too important is a sampling error in which you count those as being disproportionately representative. We might be tempted to think of over-tolerance as a less serious error, but this is only because it can seem less mean-spirited. Its results can be just as disastrous, and the reasoning behind it is every bit as bad. The point of reasoning is to be accurate, so if you overcompensate, that is also a failure of accuracy. Usually when we are over-tolerant is because we are being overly tolerant of a group we are biased towards, a group we are affiliated with. For example, if you're a Democrat, you might be more likely to criticize a Republican than a Democrat for doing exactly the same thing, all other things being equal. So if you were a Republican and a Democrat were caught using campaign money for personal use, you would criticize the Republican more harshly. If you were a Democrat and overly tolerant towards Democrats, or vice versa, if you were overly tolerant towards Republicans. This can be part of an overall partisan mindset. Such a mindset will lead individuals to tend to think in terms of us versus them. They currently say that the U.S. is more divided politically than at any time since the Civil War. One reason for this may be the fact that people now pick news that caters to feeding their own political preferences. When there were only a few television networks and newspapers, these outlets gave news with a much broader range of perspectives. But now, because news organizations are businesses, they get their customer base by catering to specific groups. If you're a conservative, you go to one news source. If you're a liberal, you go to another. This doesn't mean that all news sources are bad or that they cannot be trusted, but it helps explain political polarization. One way to get the broadest view of news is to go to news organizations that tend to cover a wide range of news, do not sensationalize, and give a wide range of perspectives. The BBC tends to be excellent for international news. It is funded by the UK, but its content is not really controlled by them, so it doesn't focus on profit-making and therefore doesn't focus on being as sensational as possible. And it delivers to a wide audience, so not to one audience who wants just one political perspective. But sometimes we might be overly tolerant towards groups because we feel guilty for them, but claim that we are not favoring them in order to make up for anything. But then instead we're just being fair. For example, suppose as an instructor, I feel sorry for a student in my class because I saw him being picked on by bullies one day. The bullies were gone before I can intervene, let's say, but not too long later, suppose I was grading a written answer from that student, and because I remember the incident, I give him a higher grade. If I am telling myself that this student's answer is really better than it is, I am distorting my own perception of reality. People can do this sort of thing without even realizing it. It's quite common. This is one reason that, when possible, I try not even to look at students' names on assignments until after I score them. Even if one thinks that one is unbiased as possible, it is always best to make sure that bias is impossible when possible to do so. The Young Turks clip talked about differences between liberals and conservatives, but in a way that made conservatives seem worse. The truth is that there are a growing number of studies that show that there are some cognitive differences between liberals and conservatives, and that both groups are prone to make different kinds of errors. In terms of the fallacies that we were talking about, conservatives would be more prone to make errors on the side of bandwagon and authority figures and symbols of loyalty, and these sorts of partisan things. While liberals tend to make more errors in terms of overcompensation, such as what we're talking about now. This isn't surprising. If people with different personalities tend to like different television programs, or different jokes, or different music, or wear different clothes on average, it isn't strange at all that there should be some statistical differences in the types of errors they make more often. Liberals are also more likely to make errors in terms of trying to be overly open to views that perhaps don't have any support, especially if they tend to be tied to cultures that might be seen as maybe oppressed in some way. In the next section, we'll be looking and talking about supernatural beliefs, and while conservatives tend to be more tied up into larger organized religions, liberals tend to more easily fall prey to mystical peddling of various stripes, such as pyramid power or crystal healing and so forth. Especially if it's presented to them as part of a larger culture they don't wish to be closed-minded about, which may seem to be discriminated against as part of the larger culture. And again, remember that this isn't something people consciously think about and decide to do. It affects people on a subconscious level. And just like with other fallacies, this can be, just subtly affecting you, or it could be having a dramatic effect on you. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the position you end up with is wrong. It's just something that people need to be aware of so that they take a step back and objectively try to evaluate the evidence. People often are not aware that they're overcompensating or being influenced by a desire to appear open-minded and so forth. Much of this brings us back to the concept of worldviews. Liberals and conservatives tend to have different worldviews, and we have already talked about how our worldviews can affect our biases and our beliefs without our even recognizing it. Regardless of the worldview, even if yours happens to be the most accurate, an automatic bias can still be dangerous, because it means that accepting something without fully understanding it, you are doing so, therefore, without actually having a rational justification. You believe something, even if you happen to be right in what you believe, you don't really fully understand why you believe it. And so you still have this sort of rational fallacy. For example, if you solved a mathematical answer by rolling dice to come up with your mathematical solution, you might end up with the right solution by pure chance, but that doesn't mean you really understood the mathematical question and could solve it. Okay, supernatural, wishful thinking, and self-deception. These three items can often be related. Many times we believe something is true because we wish it to be true. Or, alternatively, we don't want something to be true so much that we deny it's true to the point of invoking magical wishing in an attempt to change the world around us. We deceive ourselves in other ways as well, such as by rationalizing our behavior through what we wish to be true or what we convince ourselves must be the truth. Sometimes supernatural explanations are invoked when we simply don't understand something. This is a version of the fallacy of appeal to an argument from ignorance that we have discussed before. Superstition can come in various forms, from the belief that a particular article of clothing gives us luck, to belief that one can be cursed, to belief that one can tell one's future through looking at tea leaves or dice, or the reflection of sunlight off a pile of nails, or through cards, and so forth. Oh, and by the way, I don't know what most of these symbols that are floating around means. I just grabbed a bunch from everywhere. I think actually quite a few of them are from Pokemon. Okay, but we want to be careful not to say that supernatural beliefs cannot be justified a priori. A priori is a way of saying without evidence, without investigation. Many people have supernatural beliefs of one form or another, and I certainly don't want anybody to feel uncomfortable in this course, or that they have to or shouldn't engage in talking about these things because of them. Perhaps you feel you can justify some supernatural belief based on arguments and evidence, and that's fine. A belief isn't necessarily irrational if one would change it if the arguments or evidence supporting it were shown to be faulty. But one thing to keep in mind is that there are a lot of supernatural beliefs out there, from beliefs that black cats cause bad luck, to belief that witches cause milk to spoil, to belief that depression and schizophrenia are caused by demonic possession. So when one has a supernatural belief, one wants to ask if one has arguments to support that belief that differentiates them from the types of arguments and evidence that other people cite for the same types of supernatural beliefs that one rejects. For example, suppose that one believes that a particular hat is lucky because of personal anecdotal evidence. X, Y, and Z lucky things happened to me when I was wearing the hat, therefore the hat is lucky. Would one then believe that breaking mirrors cause bad luck because somebody else noticed that X, Y, and Z bad things happened to her after she had broken a mirror? If not, then one needs to either abandon the belief or find out what makes those two beliefs different in terms of justification. In other words, provide some sort of additional argument. One of the reasons why supernatural beliefs are often rejected as a category as a whole is because superstitious beliefs tend to set themselves up as unfalsifiable. In other words, the people who promote them often claim to have reasons to promote them, but regardless of any arguments or evidence, they will hold them anyways. For example, suppose I were to say that the hands of my watch move around because of tiny elves inside. You open up the watch and show me that there are no elves inside. If I claim that, oh, of course not, the elves are invisible, I am beginning to make my claim untestable. You might go further to convince me. You might say, look, here's infrared. There are no heat signatures showing the elves in infrared either. And suppose I say, well, of course not. Elves are cold-blooded. But look, you say, I put the watch in a vacuum chamber and the hands still move. And I say, elves are magical. They don't need to breathe. Then you ask exasperated that if the elves are what's moving the gears around, or the hands around, what are the gears and springs for? And that if you move the gears and springs, the hands stop moving. And I say that the elves like the gears and springs and that they refuse to work unless the gears and springs are present. This argument can go on and on. But the problem is that I'm essentially making these supernatural elves untestable. I'm holding a belief that is unfalsifiable even in theory. And a belief that is not falsifiable, at least in theory, is one that cannot actually be based on anything, since nothing, even in theory, could undermine it. If it can't be undermined, it can't be based on anything. We have already talked about numerous informal fallacies, many of which can give rise to supernatural beliefs. Bad sampling, unrepresentative sampling, false cause, appeal to fear, and so on. One fallacy that has a particular tendency to give rise to these kinds of beliefs is the argument from or appeal to ignorance. mentioned earlier in this semester. One historical example of this is sleep paralysis. When this occurs, people are in a transitional state between wakefulness and sleep, but they're unable to move. This occurs because the brain secretes chemicals that prevent us from moving around when we sleep. When these chemicals don't work right, we have a tendency to move around too much or even sleepwalk. It's not hard to see how this could have been dangerous in human ancestry if these chemicals were not, in fact, secreted. And not just human ancestry, the ancestry for any animal that, in fact, sleeps. But sometimes, when REM sleep is interrupted, there's an error, and a person can be partially conscious and yet still be unable to move, while partially in this dream state. In the past, this has led people to believe that they were being attacked or even sexually assaulted by demons. This state tends to lead people to feel that there are intruders in the room, while at the same time they can't move. More recently, the same phenomenon has been interpreted, instead of demons, as people experiencing alien abductions and being probed in various ways. And of course, there are scores and scores of other examples of arguments from ignorance giving rise to this sort of thing. Okay, on to some more video clips. This one here is an experiment regarding belief in astrology. It is an experiment that's often repeated in psychology classrooms. The next up is a TED Talk by Michael Shermer on self-deception and also on how this can lead to supernatural beliefs. Again, I'll count down so that you can pause the presentation and watch the video clips. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Incidentally, in the previous clip, an interesting point regarding the pot that Michael Shermer shows with the ambiguous image. If you show that to young enough children, they almost always see the dolphins, while almost all adults see something sexual. Below is a bit about the experiments that have their source in B.F. Skinner, showing how pigeons and other animals can actually develop superstitious-like behavior. Again, I'll pause so that you can watch this short little video, counting down from 5, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. We're not done yet. We don't want to limit ourselves to thinking about supernatural beliefs. Those are just one area. There are lots of psychological cognitive errors we can make. In this following excellent TED Talk by Courtney Warren, she does a wonderful and absolutely terrific job of summarizing quite a number of self-deception mechanisms in just 15 minutes. Like most TED Talks, this one's really great. She discusses, among other issues, denial, rationalization, also projection, cognitive distortion such as polarized thinking, emotional reasoning, overgeneralization such as hasty generalization. But before going on to it, I should mention that she mentions at one point a number of existential issues that human beings have a hard time facing, and as this is a reason why people lie to themselves and go into denial. But one potential source of difficulty for one of the things she says is that she seems to assume that the issue of whether or not human beings have free will is somehow settled, and that people who deny that are somehow in this sort of psychological era of denial. Now, maybe she's just speaking sort of generally and not scientifically or philosophically, but since this is a philosophical course, it seems like I should mention that while she's correct that many people do try to wave away their moral responsibility, the idea as to whether human beings have free will in the philosophical sense is a very complicated philosophical and scientific issue that's not been settled amongst experts. Philosophers are largely split, and neuroscientists are typically fall into one of the determinist camps. We can't go into much more detail than that here, since this is a logic and not an ethics or philosophy 100 or metaphysics course, but I felt that it would be negligent if I just let it pass by. But to be fair to Dr. Warren, maybe she's not talking about free will in this deeper sort of metaphysical or philosophical sense. Nevertheless, since this is a philosophy course that puts it in that context, I thought I should clarify it. But again, to be fair, this is after all only a 15-minute talk that she gives. With that caveat, it's a wonderful piece. In addition, right below that, there's another piece. This is a Monopoly experiment from another talk about whether or not money makes you mean. If you don't want to watch the whole talk, that's fine. You should watch the first 5 minutes or so because it illustrates a great example of self-deception. I think the whole thing is worth watching just because there are other incidents in which you can read into elements of self-deception. But at least watch those first 5 minutes where they go through this Monopoly experiment because it really shows how people can deceive themselves even when they know things are rigged in their favor. So I think that's really good. Once again, I'm going to count down from 5 so that you can pause and watch this. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Our brains fool us. This material is not all in the textbook, but it's part of the lecture, and it's important, and you should expect that some of it may appear on the test. By the way, you shouldn't think of this as extra work added to the course, for 4 reasons. This is normal in a college course. Lectures sometimes go beyond the textbook. 2, while some additional information is being emphasized, there's also some information that's being de-emphasized. 3, this is too short of a book for a 16-week course, as it contains only 12 short chapters, and a large portion of the book is taken up by appendices, indexes, and exercise solutions. And 4, tests will in no way be extra long because of this. If one question is added to the test to cover something that's in one of these videos or just in the lecture, then that means something else has to be removed. If it's in there, it's because it's something I think is important. That being said, it doesn't mean that you have to pay attention to all the trivial. I'm not going to, ask you to cite exactly what somebody says or something like that. Pay attention to what's going on in broad strokes. Okay. So for test 2, for example, the multiple choice section should take about an hour. And, I might give a little extra time just so people don't feel rushed. And you'll have about a week to write the essay portion. So in terms of what might appear in the test from this, I wouldn't expect you to memorize all the small details from videos or additional material, but you should get the idea in these very broad strokes about what's being said. All right, that said, this is important because another important impediment to cognitive reasoning comes from the myriad of ways that our brains can fool us. So this video really helps illustrate this. Now this video is an hour long, so I don't know if hopefully you can watch the whole thing. If you can't, watch it in bits and pieces. An hour probably isn't too awfully long to put into this. And it is an interesting video. It comes up on, I believe it's on Amazon, so if you don't have Prime, you might have to put up with a couple commercials. I'm sorry about that. All right, so once again, I'm going to count down from 5 so that you can pause and watch the video. Again, remember you don't have to watch all this stuff in one sitting. You can pause and come back to it and so forth. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. There's just far too much to cover in one small chapter. The last thing I would like to leave you with is just how terribly our brain handles large numbers. One example of this is the lottery, a game which a friend of mine used to call the optional tax. Think about how much time is spent in the news reporting on the lottery, especially when the prizes reach record levels. When it did so last time, the media spent many segments talking about what the best strategy would be to take if you happen to win the lottery. Should you take your money as a lump sum? Should you have it doled out to you over longer periods of time? I mean, just ponder how ridiculous it is to put all the important news stories in the world on hold to talk to one person who may or may not even be watching the news program at that time. Lots of times, people play one ticket so that they can at least have a hope of winning, they say. You can't win if you don't play. And while it might be true that you can't win if you don't play, if all you want to do is hope that you can have a chance of getting rich, you might as well hope that a relative that you don't know about wills you millions and millions of dollars, or that somebody you were kind to one day decides to give you money. The odds aren't much worse, and it doesn't cost you $2 to make those sorts of wishes or have those sorts of hopes. Or you might as well walk around hoping to run across an abandoned bag of lost money from the drug deal that's gone bad that you can claim. Or walk around the beach hoping to find a rare doubloon that washed up on shore. Or go to a yard sale or estate sales and hope to find a rare painting or other work of art or piece of lost history worth millions of dollars. Again, there's no significant difference in odds, and if you do one of those things, at least you get some exercise out of it. Now, the lottery is just one example of this. We think millions to one, but we don't really have a very good concept of how bad those odds are. So the following link I provide you with here is a link to a lottery simulator. It gives you a bankroll of $50 million and allows you to buy up to 1 million lottery tickets at a time. Of course, you don't have to buy a million at a time. You can buy 10 at a time. I think that's the lowest that it will go. How long do you think it will take you to go bankrupt? Do you think that you have the patience to actually play this game until you win a big prize? Until you win the biggest prize? Keep in mind, by the way, that this is set up to have extremely good payoffs, and unlike the real lottery, as it's feeding back into your bankroll on the small wins that you have, you're not paying a dime in taxes. So it's much better than the actual lottery odds. Again, I'll delay this so you can go ahead and travel to the link. This is the last main page. The next page is just me saying goodbye. So here's the delay, counting down from 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, that's the end of the presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. I know it was a bit of a long one this week, but I think truly that this was a lot of very interesting material. And again, especially for you psych majors out there, but for all of us, I think it's especially important to know how our minds can actively fool us without us really knowing it. And being aware of this doesn't make us immune from it, but if we're aware of it, sometimes we could take a step back and ask ourselves if we're being fully rational. We should especially be on guard when we really feel strongly about something, or when lots of people are agreeing with us. The more people who are agreeing with us, the more we should be wary and ask ourselves, well, am I following the crowd? Am I feeling like I'm reinforcing my own beliefs without additional evidence? These sorts of things. Anyway, until next time, signing off.